Let's start by going around and having everyone introduce yourself, tell us the name of the film you're involved with, and answer our first question, which is, what are you most passionate about?
I'm Brett Parker, and I am the director of Pete. And I think right now, I don't know, my passions change, but I think right now I am very passionate about telling queer stories and creating queer film.
Hi, I'm Noah Margov. I'm one of the producers for This Is Beth. It's a documentary. My other producer is Sarah Steele, and our director is Jen Randall. They're not here today, so I'm representing for everyone.
What are you most passionate about?
I've been making a lot of movies lately, so I guess that by default. I know I can speak for Sarah, whose production company um, did the whole film, and they're called Well Traveled Collective, and they are a collective of female filmmakers, and their focus is sustainability and working with as many women as possible on their sets. So I know that that's what they're passionate about, and that's how I came into the fold. So same.
Hi, I'm Pete, Brett's wife, and the co-writer of Pete. So currently I have the same passion Brett has, in addition to teaching, which I'm at school still, is telling queer stories. This is our second queer film, and really trying to get different messages, different stories out there, as many as we can.
My name is Sarah Talal Gama, Sarah T. Gama. I'm the producer and director of Mr. Love from Java to the Streets of DC. So what I'm very passionate about right now, and I'm like Brett, it's changing all the time, but I really got a lot out of making this short film, which is about a local to Washington, D.C. Indonesian American graffiti artist. And I've so enjoyed just bringing a woman's experience in the DC arts and music scene to the foreground, that I'm doing another short on one of her other murals, which is going deeper into her involvement in the music scene here in Washington, D.C. And now I'm like, oh gosh, I think I really love telling female artists' stories. So I think next I'm going to try and hunt down a poet. So I'm passionate about women's voices in the arts right now.
My name is Amy Bench, and I'm the director of More Than I Want to Remember. Brett and I actually screened together at Tribeca, which was really wonderful, and Pete also. So I have been working as a cinematographer for the last decade plus, and lately, the last 5 years or so, I've been directing. So I think my current passion, as with many of you, it's always evolving, but my current passion is to direct and make short films and eventually a feature film. But I've been working in the realm of animation for 2 of my last shorts. So that's been another passion, is working with a new art form.
I'm Kauser. I'm the writer and star of Saeed Family Christmas Eve Game Night. And passion, I would say at the moment, is just being with my people and being in community, whether it is a film set or whether it is a lovely brunch.
My name's Faith Briggs Rose. I'm the director of Reclaim Your Water, Natasha Smith. I'm been a filmmaker for the past decade or so, and I'm very passionate about stories that I feel widen the spectrum of representation and from what currently exists in the mainstream, which is also often very narrow for us. So that's something I'm very passionate about.
And certainly, Faith, that's something that goes across all of the films that you have all made. So we'd love to hear from each of you. What is it that drives you to make films about people from underrepresented communities? Why is it so important to you to share those stories?
First of all, I think animation helps create bridges when you're kind of diving into difficult conversations, or conversations that people might find adversarial, even though they're not, or confrontational, even though they're not, right? But it sort of allows, it kind of takes people by surprise, which is really a nice way. So we are finding that is a really great medium to dive into, to tell these stories, and also to create bridges of conversation, because I think the world can be afraid of what is unknown. And so the more we can get movies like all of ours out there, I think it's a great way to sort of, kind of create bridges and break down those walls of fear of change and the unknown.
For our film specifically, it was more of an underrepresented topic. It's a climbing film about a professional climber who she's very well known in the climbing community, and was sort of the top female climber for decades, and came out recently before we made the film about having struggled with an eating disorder throughout her whole professional sports career. And that was something that was not ever talked about during her time, and also during my time, and the other women who made the film with me. It's just not something that's talked about in our community. In athletics, it's like okay to be like, in climbing, it's okay to be shredded, but like there's all these code words for really like disordered behavior that are masqueraded as okay or healthy or fun. And so I think that was the big thing for us with the film, kind of shining a light on this struggle that a lot of women in climbing go through and don't talk about. And that is sort of like ingrained in the culture of the sport.
I'm originally from Florida, and I'm an educator, so the current climate really is difficult for me to hear and see and witness, even from afar. So that became another driving force with Brett and I, creating stories that not only are digestible, but maybe can see people see themselves that are from outside certain communities, like finding connections and finding common ground. So, I mean, that was one of our early, as the political climate changes, it's hard to go backwards. So it's another driving force we've had.
So I seem to just naturally want to fill the vacuum when I look out in our media landscape of, this vacuum that we're lacking women and other voices, in the storytelling landscape. Particularly when I went through film school, I was always like, oh, I love the story, but why couldn't it be an Arab American protagonist, or why couldn't it be a queer protagonist? Why? And every time I see these stories coming now, and like filling the story landscape, I feel like enriched by it. So, and I always hope that people feel that way when they see something that I've done. So I just naturally feel like I want to fill that void. But in particular, myself being an Arab American, I decided somewhere in my film school experience, we talked a lot about try to tell stories from your community should really portray something authentic. And I really took that to heart. And I find that, especially now that I'm older, there are a lot of people I know have a lot of experience in lots of walks of life, in American life, right? And yet their stories are not being told. So I feel committed to that, but I also want to commit to people who are in my community, because they're doing all the things too, except for, pretty much walking on the moon, right? Like they're all doing amazing things. So I would just want to put my camera on them and see what happens.
Much like many of you, I'm interested in telling stories and lifting up voices of people that aren't getting enough voice in traditional media. And that, from my last couple of films, has involved people from immigrant communities, specifically women who have been forced to flee their homes. And I've also found animation to be a really great medium for telling these stories, because they often have occurred in the past, but they're also quite emotionally draining during the interviews, but also really important to tell. So it's a way to break up the interviews and not put a lot of pressure on the protagonists, to keep the conversations as casual and intimate as possible. So there's a lot of reasons that I've chosen animation. I think it also is accessible to a lot of people. And they may not want to go see a film about immigration, but they might be interested in seeing an animated film. So I think there's a lot of reasons that I've chosen this path, and And I also live in Texas, so it's also a response to a lot of the politicization of issues like immigration in our state and nationally.
For sighted filmmakers who've gained that, I think a big part of the impetus was also just centering stories of joy for our communities. As a Muslim queer person, to be able to see a character who ends up with a happy ending sort of in this rom-com way and world is something we're often not afforded. One, the representation is not on screen, and secondly, to have happy endings isn't on screen. And so I feel like that was a big driver for it, for me and for my team, and our amazing director, Fazli Mirza, who couldn't be here today. But that's something we really connect on in terms of just creating stories that not only normalize us, but give ourselves something to celebrate and something to be aspirational, and to, in a sense, like manifest to for ourselves and our communities.
I love all the answers here. I think similar to what we've said, I think both Pete and Casa really, I share similar reasons. I think a lot of us come from communities where the images that we get to see of ourselves are really narrow or extremely misrepresentative of who we are. I think that really affects young people, especially in terms of what they imagine they can be. So a lot of what drives me is hopefully creating images that help widen the spectrum of imagination for us in our own communities sometimes, in addition to, maybe someone else taking the time to try to understand us better. But I think a lot of our communities struggle a lot with self-confidence. So I hope that those positive stories help us with that. And I think another thing that drives me is being able to create film teams behind the camera that are representative of the subjects in front of the camera. It often creates a much richer story and experience for the subject too. So that's something that really always makes me feel good.
We wanted to ask if anybody had anything particularly from someone else's film that resonated with them.
Faith, I love surfing, so it really resonated. And with my kids, I'm always trying to, my dream would be to start an urban surf club, and I've seen one starting here in the city. So that story really spoke to me from the perspective of water and being in it and how I feel. And then, I just really loved watching the story.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'll say for Noam, I know Sarah Steele really well. We've worked together before and got to see some early cuts of This Is Beth, and it was really exciting to see that film come out into the world, so that people don't have to be like these shiny versions of themselves all the time. And it was a really brave film for Beth, who's someone who has been the spotlight in such a big way. So I really appreciate seeing that film too.
Thank you. I also really resonated with what you said about like the next generation of girls, because that was a huge thing for us with the film. Like, not just the representation, but something we were always thinking about is like, what if people had these conversations like when we were kids, and how would that have changed how we viewed ourselves? And so I really resonate with everything you guys are saying.
How do you think it would have changed how you view yourself in each of your films? And was there something you did see that had an impact on you?
I don't think I saw myself represented growing up. I'm also an immigrant. I grew up pretty poor in Florida. And I was really obsessed with Disney princesses. So I think I had a really skewed sense of reality. But I think like I think what's exciting about some of these films is like, what Faith said, like the bravery of it. And I think kind of the opposite maybe of what I had seen growing up. And I think we're seeing narratives like that more and more, but I think it's really exciting to see like actual women or girls speaking up for themselves, speaking their truths and their stories, and being brave. And I don't think I saw that much of that growing up.
I think some of us, and kids now, people grow up thinking they're weird, thinking they're the only one like them. Mental health has always been difficult, and with the advent of social media, it's even more so. One of the reasons for me why I started making films is I felt like what kids were seeing about themselves, particularly in the Black community, was just like, if that was all they got to aspire to. And I feel like with TikTok and other things, it's only attacking people like younger with less opportunities. And so, yeah, it just feels like the interruption of that sense of loneliness could do a lot of good. And I think being able to see films like these can really help kids know that even if they feel alone, either in their home or in their school or in their town, there is a wider community out there for them, which could, change people's lives. So that's really important.
If I maybe had seen my thing as a kid, I probably would have come out sooner. So that would have been nice.
What does it mean to all of you to be women and gender nonconforming people working in the industry behind the scenes? Do you feel like there's been any improvement in terms of opportunities? And what are your hopes for the future in that regard?
I've been an animator, so in the industry for like 26 years, but directing, we directed our first film like 2019. So it's an interesting experience, right? Because I can definitely say there are more women in animation in general, right? There are a few more female directors within the animation industry, but it's still, the numbers are very skewed. It's not what you'd want to see. And then, to be honest, there are very few, and I'm speaking within the animation like sort of industry, right? But there is not a lot of queer representation or storytelling, and it's limited. And some platforms are much more open to hearing, queer stories, and others are not. And I'm definitely in the midst of sort of like kind of trying to figure that out.
I'd say I feel like there have been some improvements for sure. With technology changing and becoming more accessible, there's been some democratization in terms of access to the tools to make stories. But, the access to funding and other types of power structures and decision making still very much held by those who are white, male, and moneyed. It's a very pay to play industry. Being independently wealthy goes a very long way as a filmmaker. And so, when that's not necessarily your experience, or you don't have those like legacy of connections, it's definitely very difficult to get a film made and figure out how to get it out there. As a female filmmaker, I think there's a lot of great ways that we're connecting with each other to support each other. And there's a long way to go.
I work independently, so I feel like I can address this question related to story, and I'd be curious to hear what everyone else thinks. I feel like there is more interest for other sorts of stories, and I've waited a long time to see that, particularly for anyone else who came up through film school. Like I remember when people didn't want to hear about a story about an Arab American or a woman who wore hijab or something, and the landscape's completely different, which is so good to see. But I still think there's a lot of work to do around making these stories and making sure people see them, because sometimes it's kind of sequestered away on streaming or whatnot. And I mean, that's just a fact of life. But also there's still a lot of work you have to do to make these stories palatable. This is still like an American society. And, but I mean, I still feel we've come a long way, that people really do finally want to see other types of protagonists, but it still has to fit in a way. And I think that's okay. You can still be authentic.
The only thing I would say is, as a very, very rookie filmmaker, and it wasn't a career I thought I would ever, you would have asked me 5 years ago if I would have made a film, I said no. But film festivals, I would have never also realized how the value of a festival until I started going to these festivals. And it is a place where I see diversity. and it is a place that is actively trying to reach a broader audience. So I'm such a proponent now of supporting these festivals. I really, growing up, it wasn't something I went to on a regular basis, and just with each one, and we've had the pleasure of being at. I've just been amazed at how film festivals really are at the forefront in the fight. So that does make me feel better that they're actively. It's clearly a conscious effort, right, to create spaces like this and create films that might not otherwise currently be able to be seen on these larger streaming platforms. So that makes me feel hopeful that there's this underlying fight occurring for marginalized voices.
I'd like to ask each of you if there's something that you learned about yourself on the journey while you were making your film.
Both my character and my subject and I, Natasha, we're both Black women in America, which means we have very different experiences because we're not a monolith. I think that in editing, there were some moments where I had to really question the idea of am I putting my revolution on my subject, or am I letting them speak their truth and share their story? And I had some moments where I probably would have wanted to say it differently or be more radical or push it more in a different way. And that's not necessarily the words that she chose to use. And so I think I've had a few moments as a filmmaker in the past couple of years, but working on this film is one of the things that stuck out of being I like to call myself a story sharer rather than a storyteller, and really make sure I'm sharing the story as I'm finding it and as it's being shared with me versus coming in with my agenda, even if I'm coming from the same community. So I think that was something I learned about myself, is just how to continue to check in through that editing process and make sure that I'm editing the story, but I'm not editing my subject.
I really love how you talk about being a story sharer, because my short in LUNAFEST is a documentary. And this goes to what I learned about myself, because the subject of my documentary is actually the sister of an old friend. So I really felt a huge amount of responsibility that I hadn't felt with other projects, because I knew the audience and I knew, her sister. And so their stepmother is a big part of the story as well. So I was also having this responsibility of a beloved family member who had passed on. So I found that that forced me to become like a mirror more than somebody who was shaping a story, kind of like what you were talking about. And so I really felt that I think I found the best way that I can tell a documentary story, which is to be that mirror. And I hadn't become that yet until I made this film, but I know that that's how I will approach everything I do nonfiction from now on. It's just my responsibility is to stay out of the way, right? All I can do is take this light and shine it out. So I related to what you said, Faith, and that's how I felt about it. Just be a mirror, not a lens.
We made the film during the pandemic. I interviewed Mugeni in January of 2020. And I think I've learned a lot of things because the film has been out in the world for the past year. But one thing I learned is that despite all, and it kind of relates, I didn't answer the question about being a female filmmaker and how that's evolved over time, because it's a very complicated question and answer, because I ask myself that all the time and I have to keep getting back in the saddle or whatever to go, because it is a challenge. We don't have the same funding resources and network that other people might have. But I think making the film and seeing the response to it and going on my intuition, despite having 2 kids at home, and I'm sorry that they've been running in and out while we've been doing this, I think it's just a testament that I have to keep making work despite things that feel like huge obstacles that are insurmountable, like just not having enough time or energy or resources. But I think despite all of that, I was able to make a film and get it out in the world and have a wonderful response, and Mugeni's been delighted. And, there's just the things that you get back when you make a film that you're proud of and that other people respond to, I think are immeasurable. So that's the fuel that keeps me going. So I just learned to keep going and to just put everything you have into it and to like turn obstacles into opportunities.
I would say, if looking back now and I think about that, I think just the power of storytelling, story sharing as healing too. The story, it was partially inspired by my own life and like my own experiences with my sisters and my partner. And so looking back now, it's almost feels like a bit of a time capsule to be like, oh, that's where I was then. And to be able to look back on it that way and to have that moment of like, oh, I put it on paper, I put it out in the world, and the catharsis of that is truly like a gift and feels like a very healing thing. And so if anything, it's a reminder to, as Amy, like you said, continue creating and the power of that.
I really relate to something Brett said about the collaboration of it. There was something Beth said in the film about climbing, and she said, I learned that a soft body is a strong body. And I think like a lot of these things, like a lot of success in our society is defined in like these really hyper masculine terms, like strength and like the lone genius and like having like a singular vision. And the women that I worked with on this project, like there was just such a like care and softness for each other. And it was just one of the best collaborations I've ever had. And it really changed my perspective on like how you can make movies collaboratively and like what leadership can look like. And it doesn't have to be like one guy shouting at everyone, usually a guy. But it doesn't have to be one person, with a singular vision shouting. Like it can be this very like fluid, organic, collaborative, soft, communicative thing. So I feel like my definition of like strength and courage and success has like really changed through this project.
Brett and Pete, being married, were you surprised to learn about each other while you were making this film together?
When we were doing her voice recording, she kept breaking down because she narrates the film, and she kept breaking down and crying, and she'd stop talking when she'd do that. And I would say, hey, if you finish the sentence, we can use it. We'll figure that one out. But if you don't say the words at all, we got nothing. No, actually, it was amazing working together. And we wrote obviously it's an original story about Pete, and we wrote the screenplay together. But as I would dive into it, I would always have to go back to her. We have really different roles then when we're in production. But it was a really great pairing because I would get to go back to her and I'd be like, but wait a minute. But what were you feeling here? And what were you thinking here? And then what was like, I could really dive into those specifics. So it was really nice. And it was this great way to like really be able to flesh out the film. So it was very fun. And she did finally say all the words she needed to say.
What's your dream for the future of people in marginalized communities?
To be seen and heard.
I wish whatever the community is, it wasn't like a little box or like its own tab. I think these stories and the films that I've seen from this group are a testament to that. Like they can and should be mainstream. They're just human stories. And so, yeah, I hope that they can just be seen as like stories and they don't have to have these like qualifiers on them.
It's hard for me not to think of my students. The school I work at is 75% immigrant population, and the remainder percentage is no one that looks like me. And just to really, I think I see the importance every time they can see themselves and relate. And until film in just recent years, really, to be honest, I mean, just super recent, to have my students seeing themselves in film and how powerful that's been. So if film is the jumping off point, then that's how I want to see the future, because the impact is more than I could have imagined in their faces.
My hope is for all our communities that more of our stories get told and are put out there. But I also want more perspectives from within the communities, because, again, each community is not just a monolith, so more diversity, more differences, more stories, more representation. And again, getting to that broader, richer perspective that is so enriching. And then I love to see for myself. So that is my hope for all our communities, is more of the more.
And in addition to in front of the lens or represented in animation, people that are working on the films have better opportunities. People that are marginalized have better opportunities than they do now, because yes, there are initiatives to increase representation, but I think, as has been mentioned, there's still a long way to go.
I look forward to a future where, these different pockets of, folks who are not the cis white male, thriving in such greatness that it also becomes that we're all able to be in solidarity with each other as well, and see the power of solidarity in that.
Everything that everyone said, and uplift, repair, abundance, thriving, freedom, and sovereignty. Those are my hopes.
All right. Well, mic drop. I don't think we can get better than that. We cannot thank you all enough for joining us tonight, and for all of the beautiful work that you have presented to us. We need more of it, and keep going. And thank you all so much.